This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Monday's program, we begin with K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. He covers last week's market activity and provides an update on the meat demand monitor, plus information that shows that millennials are using protein to aid them in meeting their fitness goals, providing another opportunity for targeting consumers. We are also joined by K-State professor in precision agriculture and department head of agronomy, Raj Khosla. He discusses research that he has been a part of for over a decade looking at the creation and use of biodegradable soil chips that aim to take real-time measurements of water and nitrate content in soil. We end with this week's wildlife segment where K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts discusses chronic wasting disease in deer and how it impacts the state of Kansas. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. First up, our weekly look at the activity taking place in the livestock market. K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor covers the market activity today and provides an update on meat demand, plus an opportunity to market protein to millennials for aiding in meeting fitness goals. Glynn, I guess first off, just starting off with the cash cattle markets, are we seeing any positive movement there?
We are. Some of the numbers I'm going to outline here are flat on the week and some are up, but overall it was a calm, if not positive, week for the markets. As you say, the cash markets, USDA AMS called the fed cattle market on Thursday at about 157. That's up just a little bit, basically flat, slightly up for the week. Then they called the feeder cattle market flat, up depending on what weight class. A couple lots I always like to share here for context. This is specific to the Kansas market. Is there was a lot of about 50 head weighing 673 pounds that came in at 194. And there's another lot, also about 50 head, that weighed a little bit more at 740, came in at $2. Both those numbers would be basically on par with the week before. So before we go further through the rest of the market, specific to the cash market there, Jeff, would be flat, if not up a little bit.
And futures markets, I guess futures contracts also relatively flat?
Yeah, and feeder cattle is a little stronger. When we look at live cattle, the nearby December contract closed 153 through Thursday. That'd be flat on the week. Early look on Friday is it's up. January feeder cattle was 181. That's up about $3 for the week. So of the numbers I've shared with everybody so far, the strength was in the board for feeder cattle, and that in part reflects, I think, corn prices. So corn prices have come down some in the last 10 days, and that tends to support feeder cattle prices.
And then on the boxed beef cutout prices.
Yeah, so that's a mixed story. So Thursday, choice boxed beef was $255, up about $3 from the holiday-impacted week before. We look over at Select on Thursday, came in at $227, was down about $7. So choice is up, Select was down. Demand for higher quality beef is up, but some challenges moving the lower quality Select developed this past week.
In terms of processing, it looks like numbers are still up?
Yeah, we are. There's a lot of discussion on the cattle on feed numbers. We've turned the corner. Those are going to start coming down, but we're still supporting a pretty high slaughter volume. Initial estimates through the week on through Thursday were for 512,000 head, and that would be up from 493 the same week the year before.
And as we switch to the demand, what are we seeing in terms of November meat demand?
Yeah, so the information I'm going to share here is a early look at the meat demand monitor. The listeners here probably know that's a project based at K-State. It's beef and pork checkoff funded. This is an ongoing national survey, and it allows us to speak to domestic meat demand, and I'm going to share the beef demand number specifically, but separately for retail grocery store from food service. And the general story is, there's continued weakness that is building. When we look at grocery store retail demand in November, meat demand was down versus October, and unfortunately also lower than it was a year earlier in November of 2021. When we flip that over to food service demand, and specifically for demand for meals when you're out for dinner away from home, demand in November was up a little bit from October, but specific to the beef and pork meals we look at, so ribeye steak, a hamburger-based, entree meal, pork chop-based meal, and the baby back ribs, or the 2 beef, 2 pork we're looking at, those demand metrics are also down from the year earlier. So overall, we continue to see just consumers kind of tightening their financial belt, as we have described that, Jeff. Inflation, while it is coming down a little bit from the latest read estimates that we're getting, is still above wage growth. So the average resident in the U.S. is falling behind financially, and we're seeing that hit the meat category.
I guess I'm a little curious as to the at-home meal rates being better than, I guess, dining out. Is that what you're saying, because of the added cost of dining out?
Yeah, and specifically lunch and dinner, the percentage that said they had their, those meals at home in November was up from October. And I do think it's exactly that is, all else equal, the cost of that meal at home tends to be lower than it is away from home. The main reason for that is you're providing free labor is what's underneath that, right? When you prepare your own meal and do your own dishes, when we go out to eat, effectively part of that meal price is paying somebody else to do that, so the service charge. And, historically, when finances get tight, we tend to see people eat out less, and we're seeing that show up in different ways here in November.
So that may be something we continue to see throughout the rest of this year for sure.
Yeah, I am anticipating it for the next several months, and it's reinforced by some, I call them sentiment questions. So again, in this survey-based effort, and it's a large data set that I'm pulling information from, our listeners here, Jeff, probably have heard of the Consumer Sentiment Index. A lot of people reference it. It's been going on for, I think, over 50 years now at the University of Michigan. It's a totally separate large survey that I'm not pulling information from that, but I've used a couple of the same questions in this meat demand focused effort, and I'm trying to work my way towards letting people know sentiment is pretty poor. So the average resident is fairly pessimistic financially. Specifically here in November of this year, 40% indicate they're doing worse, financially speaking, than they did a year ago. When I asked that same question back in November of 21, 31% said they're doing worse. So we've had a notable increase in the percentage of the population that says they're doing worse financially. So those are examples of looking back. Now looking forward in the upcoming year, people are also more pessimistic than they were a year ago. So I think the reality is wages aren't keeping up with inflation and other related things like the stock market. While it's done better in the last 6-8 weeks, it's still down for the year and so forth. So some wealth effects are probably embedded in that sentiment. And anytime, you ask an economist if consumers are financially concerned, they're probably going to tighten their budget. I think that's what we're seeing.
Is there anything on the meat side then that could be more, available to those that are trying to tighten their belt?
Meat is a very broad comment, and we usually do beef, pork, and chicken separate, and then you do steak versus ground and so forth. There's a lot of different cuts out there. One can think about, right, trading from steak to ground, or maybe from a pork chop to ham, and so on and so forth, depending on what prices you're seeing at different times, or bacon down to a pork chop even on a dollar per pound basis. So you can keep those meat proteins in your diet, but maybe a different cut. But there's also a quality grade component. So, maybe we have some folks trade from prime to choice or choice to select in the beef space where we have a grading. Some are actually finding that buying a smaller package size. So instead of buying 16 ounces of bacon, we're buying 12 ounces. There's a litany of adjustments, I guess, to answer the question there, Jeff. The good news is general interest in protein in the diet is actually pretty strong. We added some questions here in November that about 1/3 of the population nationally says they intentionally include protein in their diet to help meet their personal fitness goals, whether that's jogging or muscle strengthening exercises. And that particular comment is extra relevant for millennials. So nearly half of millennials, and for quick reference, millennials are those born between 1981 and 1996. They're more likely, 1 and 2 basically, say they eat protein for that reason. And conversely, baby boomers are much less likely. Only about 16% of baby boomers say they eat protein for that reason, intentionally. The reason I'm highlighting that is the millennial group is a large group. Their buying power continues to grow, and they're going to be here for the foreseeable future as customers. And hopefully that gives some staying power to various components of these adjustments you're asking me about.
Does that mean that their protein source is what we were talking about, the beef, the chops, that sort of thing?
In general, yes. The question is asked broader, right, for protein to capture all those. So I don't want to mislead people. They could be eating protein that is beef, pork, chicken, salmon, even a plant-based patty. Those would all be included in that as protein sources. But in the same effort, we also ask all these folks what you had yesterday. So they're called prior day recall questions, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Did you have it at home or away from home, and then which of those proteins did you include? And certainly chicken, beef, and pork are the 3 primary proteins that people say they had yesterday, and that matches up with USDA estimates of consumption and so forth. So in general, I definitely think it is the meat proteins that are those millennials I'm talking about are referring to. But I want to be clear for your listeners, they could also be getting protein as well from, seafood, plant-based, and other items that aren't meat livestock items.
As these millennials then are identified as wanting added protein, how do we reach them with that message?
Yeah, that gets into a marketing question and may even differ by going a little bit back to your cut. Do you have a product that's convenient, easy to eat on the go, ready to eat? Those kind of things are pretty important for a busy, the typical millennial is, all our listeners are busy, so I don't want to mislead, but millennials are more likely to have children at home, so they're juggling other things, not just their own schedule, but their kids' schedule and so forth. So the value of convenience tends to be higher. Given advice to, in this case, probably the beef and the pork industry, I think elevated importance on convenience and ease of consuming your products is even more important with the millennial generation than, say, the baby boomers.
And it's obvious that we need to find some markets to replace those who are eating less protein.
Yeah, and you and I have been talking domestic almost exclusively here so far, Jeff, but the third leg of that, demand stool is foreign. So every beef and pork product we produce in the U.S. is either consumed here domestically through grocery store or away from home. So those are the two domestic channels. Or the third leg of that three-legged stool is foreign demand. We export it. And both the beef and pork industry have been very successful in the last 10 years. They're growing those markets. And, I'm optimistic that'll continue for the next 10 years, and that will be part of that quote-unquote replacement.
I guess maybe in closing, Glynn, what do you see for maybe the week ahead or even the month ahead?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion and interest in the January cattle inventory report, where we're at with the number of cows that have been liquidated, what USDA says that is versus the weekly slaughter numbers and so forth. We're not going to get an update that here within December, but I am going to start alluding to that because we're less than 2 months from that. There's going to be a lot of interest in that. We have the Thanksgiving holiday now in the rearview mirror. We're upcoming on the Christmas one. I think there's going to be a lot of interest on exactly what consumers do. The wholesale buying of meat, getting ready for Christmas is well in play, but exactly how many people pay up for, a prime rib at Christmas, how many try to make, their Christmas meal and or their New Year's celebration a little more economical are going to be some things we really watch the next few weeks ahead. I'm cautiously optimistic. There's a jobs report that came out that actually unemployment is not rising. At face value, that is good. There's some interest rate discussion and so forth that are around that we could talk about. But specifically, if unemployment rate stays low, that itself probably gives us some more staying power of consumers paying up for those celebration meals. And we're going to be watching that a lot in the next few weeks, Jeff.
All right, Glynn, as always, thanks for the update.
Thanks for having me on.
That's K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. For more information, visit agmanager.info. This is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Dr. Raj Khosla, and he is a professor of precision agriculture here at K-State and also the head of agronomy. So, Dr. Khosla, thanks for joining us today. I'm so happy to have you in studio.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for having me over here.
Absolutely. So today our conversation is really going to focus around precision agriculture and technology in agriculture. And part of that is this over a decade-long research project that you've been working on, and it's with soil chip research. So let's start with that. Where did this idea really stem from?
Yeah, so precision agriculture has now been around for about 30 years or so, I would say. And if you look at what industry has enabled us, practitioners, scientists, farmers, and farmers community, is that they have provided us the tools and technology to apply agricultural inputs, how much we want, where we want, when we want in our fields. But we all know we can only manage what we can measure. So while we have the tools and technology to deliver our farm inputs to the level of granularity we would like to see them, how do we make decision? How much to apply, where to apply, when to apply? That calls for measuring properties of interest. We all know water is precious, okay? And we have center pivots or laterals or drip system that we can deliver how much water we want, where we want, when we want in the field. But how do we make a decision? And precision ag research has shown us that there is tremendous amount of spatial, meaning space-related, and temporal, time-related variability that exists in our soil systems, in our fields, farm fields, crop fields, in landscapes. We need to measure those. And to measure those requires sensing, okay? And that has been the brainchild behind, could we place sensors out in the field in enough quantity so that we don't have to do guesswork how much soil moisture is in the soil profile, and use that information along with other pieces of information such as the crop type, the growth stage, soil type, humidity, temperature, wind speed, all the other environmental parameters that help us decide how much water need to be applied, when and where. The idea is how do we, enhance the water use efficiency, use every drop of water that goes into the production system. That's an example for water. There are other important parameters of interest that are important to ag.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned water. Obviously, I feel like the summer, the drought we've been experiencing, that's something that's on everybody's minds. But nitrate is also something that you guys have been measuring as well.
That's right. So there are two sensor development elements that our group, along with two other groups that have been working together. One group is with University of California, Berkeley. They are the computer and electrical engineers. And then another group of material scientists and engineers from University of Colorado, Boulder, and then a group of us from our lab focused on soil science and agronomy. So the engineers are putting together chips, very small chips, that we can distribute out in the field and maybe even bury them down to 6 inches depth, that are batteryless and are hopefully one day made out of biodegradable material that you can distribute out in the field in dozens, if not hundreds. And you can communicate with them through radio waves. So they're basically sleeping all the time out in the soil. And when you ping them with the radio wave, they wake up for a millisecond, do their job or measurement, and send that information back to your phone or to your desktop computer. And then you use geostatistics or statistical tools or software, if you may, to stitch that data together and almost instantaneously. And that way, as a farmer or as a practitioner, when you're getting ready to make a decision how much water to be applied, where and when, you get an instant record of how much is out there in your soil profile, and then all of the parameters that I mentioned to you earlier. And when was the last time you irrigated, or when was the last precipitation, and incorporate all those into your decision tree, how you make a decision, how much water to apply, where and when, and then actuate them in real time. And in fact, in our big scheme of things, I envision that someday when we have these suite of sensors functional, not just prototypes or research grade, but functional and commercially available, that farmers will ping them multiple times during the week or even during the day, that as the pivot or the lateral is moving across the field, they can change the rate of application on the go.
Wow. Real time. That's the key here. Because
that's the key.
We were chatting beforehand, and you were telling me, you were like, this technology, obviously, parts of it have been available for a long time. Obviously, we already take soil samples right now. We send them off, and we get that data back, but it takes time, and it takes resources to take the time to sample, send it off, those people to process it, send the results back. And over the course of that time, obviously changes can happen. You can get a big rainstorm that comes through, or, the microbes in your soil change, or what have you, whatever it may be. So this is really the appeal of this research, why it's so significant. It's because it's the innovation around that already available resource, just real time.
Samantha, you're exactly right. Ability to measure soil moisture has been around for many, many, many decades. What's new here is ability to measure soil moisture in situ without disturbing the soil, without destructively taking a soil sample from the field, without having the need for someone to go to the field, collect soil sample, analyze it, process it, send it to the lab, or get a measurement. All that happens in situ, in place. And you can take this measurement as frequently as you want or as less frequently as you want. And then because you have so many of these sensing devices scattered out in the field, and you're using internet along with these sensing devices to send that information to your phone or to your desktop computer, that you can stitch that product together and get the big picture of your field, of your farm, whatever have you, whatever is your object of interest, and then use decades of knowledge and science that we have in place, and as we continue to learn more about how Mother Nature behaves, it allows us to make better decision-making process. how do we apply the right input at the right time, at the right place, in the right amount, and in the right manner. The 5 R's of precision agriculture. I think every day we're getting closer to be able to deliver what precision agriculture promises us.
Absolutely, and what a game changer that would be, especially, like I said, in situations like this year where drought has been so prevalent across the entire state. But when we think about, especially western Kansas, the allocation amounts that they have of how much water they actually have available to them, a tool like this would allow them to precisely, without lack of a better word,
right,
decide how much is needed and necessary for their crops to continue to grow, but then also plan for the future in case the drought is prolonged, like we've really seen.
You're exactly right. So imagine an irrigated crop of corn may take about 2 acre-feet of water. But if you have only 1 acre-feet of water, well, how do you decide how much to apply, when to apply, where to apply, so that you can maximize the impact of that water on your crop production systems? And think about it. The USDA Agriculture Innovation Agenda that came out in the year 2020 calls for, it's a really ambitious plan, it calls for that by 2050, we will continue to increase our production by 40% as compared to year 2020. But not only that, I think if we continue our trajectory, we can get there. But what else that USDA Agricultural Innovation Agenda calls for is doing all of that with 50% less water and 50% less nitrogen. And that's why we cannot leave any room for error. We have to be precise. We have to be reliable. We have to be rapid, reproducible, and not just once or twice, but every time we're making a decision to apply a input to our fields. And, our focus is on water and nitrogen, 2 of the big drivers in ag production systems. But there are others around our nation that are working on other parameters of interest as well.
If you're tuning into this and are interested in learning more about Dr. Khosla's work, hoping to develop biodegradable sensors, more information on this research can be found in the fall 2022 issue of the Kansas State University research magazine, Seek. Seek is a biannual Kansas State publication and serves as Kansas State University's flagship research magazine, which invites readers to see K-State's research, scholarly, and creative activities and discoveries. So be sure to check out more of Dr. Khosla's research at K-State's Seek Research magazine. I'll have it linked in the show notes of today's program and an easy-to-find link. So once again, if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check that out. We'll be back with more shortly on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Ag Today intern Katie Figge. Today we have with us in studio Drew Ricketts, K-State Wildlife Extension Specialist. So thanks for joining us today, Drew.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Katie.
So today we'll be talking about chronic wasting disease. So Drew, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Chronic wasting disease is in a group of diseases that we call transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And that's a really complicated name, but basically it means that this is a disease that can be transmitted and it causes the brain to get really swollen and to have holes in it. So that's the spongiform part. The encephalopathy part is the swelling.
So we talked about what it is, but what causes it?
It's really weird. So last time we talked about hemorrhagic diseases, and hemorrhagic diseases are caused by a virus. It's a living organism, and chronic wasting disease is caused by a prion. A prion is a protein, and all mammals naturally have prions in them. But sometimes they get folded incorrectly and they become transmissible. So there's not very much living material there, and it's hard to kill them. They can persist for at least 50 years in the environment. They can survive close to the melting point of aluminum. It takes 10 minutes in 50% bleach to denature these proteins, and the challenge with it is it's always fatal. There's no treatment for this disease.
So if there's no treatment and it's this really bad disease, where are we currently seeing it in the U.S. most? Are we seeing it in Kansas?
We are seeing it in Kansas. So the first place it was detected was at a wildlife research center in Colorado. In Kansas, it first was detected in the state down around Pratt, and then after that, about 2005, it was detected in the northwest corner of the state and then gradually became more abundant there. In fact, in northwest Kansas, there are some counties where we can see 40 to 50% prevalence in the harvested male deer. Now, Wildlife and Parks is doing much more intensive sampling, and we found it all the way east to Missouri in Bourbon County, but it's still most common in basically the western half of the state as far as we can tell.
So as for transmission, can this be transmittable to livestock and humans?
So it's transmitted among deer through body fluid exchange and through eating, where body fluids have been deposited. Because it's just a protein, it can move through plant material from the soil to the tips of plants that the deer are going to eat. So that would be the main way that it would transmit to livestock, would be through livestock feeding in areas where deer saliva exists in the environment, or deer urine, because that's another fluid that it can be in. The studies that have looked at this have not found that it's transmissible orally to cattle or to sheep. And the way that they looked at that was they ground up deer brains that were infected with the prion, and they fed them to those animals. However, they were able to transmit it to sheep by blowing a mist of those brain homogenate into their nose, and also to sheep and cattle by injecting it straight into their brain. So it's not transmissible to them by normal routes, but we can give it to them. I think if this was going to be a common disease in livestock, it's been around long enough that we would have seen it at this point.
Interesting studies. And so on the human side of things, what does that look like for us?
We have never detected a case where someone got a TSE from handling a deer or from eating venison. The studies that have looked at this, of course, we can't infect people experimentally with diseases, right? And so what they've done is use macaques, which are a species of primate, and we've got some conflicting evidence there. There is one study where they believe that they got transmission by feeding infected brain homogenate to these primates, and there was another study that couldn't replicate that. So the challenge with this disease is we really don't know whether it's transmissible to humans or not. So we need to be really careful around it.
So I know we've talked a lot about this disease, but are there some additional resources people could look at or kind of get read up on this information?
Wildlife and Parks has a big information campaign on this right now. So if you go to cwdks.org, there's some great information there about chronic wasting disease and about disease surveillance for that. So right now there's free testing of deer, and I would encourage everybody who's harvesting deer this year to get those deer tested before they eat the meat.
So as always, all of that information will be put in the show notes of today's program. Once again, that was Drew Ricketts, K-State Wildlife Extension Specialist, speaking on chronic wasting disease. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.